The evening started like any other Saturday. Judge David Harrison was driving home from his daughter's college graduation, still wearing his best suit and tie. The ceremony had been beautiful, and his heart was full of pride. His daughter had just earned her degree in social work, and they had celebrated with dinner at her favorite restaurant. As he drove through the quiet suburban streets, David was thinking about how far his family had come. Growing up in a rough neighborhood, he never imagined he would one day be sitting on the county bench making decisions that affected thousands of lives. The radio played softly in the background and the evening air was warm and pleasant. Then he saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. David pulled over immediately, just like he had taught his own children to do. He put the car in park, turned off the engine, and placed his hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. These were the rules he knew by heart, the same ones every black parent teaches their children. Officer Blake Thompson approached the driver's side window with his hand resting on his weapon. His partner, Officer Luis Rivera, positioned himself on the passenger side. Both men looked tense, as if they were approaching a dangerous criminal rather than a middle-aged man in a business suit. "License and registration," Thompson demanded, without any greeting or explanation for the stop. "Good evening, officers," David said calmly. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" Thompson's eyes narrowed. "You ran that stop sign back there. Don't play dumb with me." David knew he hadn't run any stop sign. He was always careful about traffic laws, especially in this part of town where he knew he stood out. "I'm sorry, officer, but I'm certain I came to a complete stop at every sign. Are you calling me a liar?" Thompson's voice rose. "Step out of the vehicle now." "Officer, there's no need for that. I'm happy to provide my license and registration." David kept his voice steady, even though his heart was starting to race. He had been in situations like this before, but it never got easier. "I said get out of the car," Thompson shouted, his hand moving closer to his weapon. David slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. As he stepped out, he kept his hands visible and moved carefully. "I'm reaching for my wallet now," he announced clearly. "Don't move." Rivera yelled from the other side of the car. "Keep your hands where we can see them." "I need to get my identification," David explained patiently. "It's in my wallet in my back pocket." Thompson grabbed David's arm roughly and spun him around, pushing him against the car. "Spread your legs and put your hands on the roof." The metal was cold against David's palms as he complied. He could feel other drivers slowing down to stare as they passed. The humiliation burned in his chest, but he knew that any resistance could make things much worse. "What do we have here?" Thompson said as he began searching David's pockets. He pulled out the leather wallet and flipped it open. "David Harrison. This address is in the fancy part of town. What's a guy like you doing with an address like this?" "I live there," David replied simply. "I work downtown," Rivera laughed. "Sure you do. What kind of work? Let me guess, you're probably going to tell us you're some big-shot businessman or something." David hesitated. In his experience, mentioning his position as a judge sometimes made things worse. Some officers took it as a challenge or thought he was lying. "I work in the legal field." "Legal field," Thompson repeated mockingly. "Like what, you're a lawyer?" "Something like that," David said quietly. Thompson continued searching through the wallet, pulling out credit cards and David's driver's license. He examined each item carefully, as if looking for evidence of fraud. "These cards have your name on them, but that doesn't prove anything. Could be stolen." The search continued for several more minutes. Thompson and Rivera went through every pocket, every fold of David's jacket. They found his car keys, some breath mints, and a few receipts from dinner. Nothing suspicious, nothing illegal, but they acted as if each item was potential evidence of wrongdoing. "Where are you coming from tonight?" Rivera asked. "My daughter's graduation ceremony. We had dinner afterward at Romano's downtown." "Expensive place," Thompson noted. "You sure you didn't steal that credit card you used to pay?" David closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "The card is mine. The receipts have my name on them. You can call the restaurant if you need to verify." "Don't tell us how to do our job," Thompson snapped. A small crowd had started to gather on the sidewalk. Some people were recording with their phones, which seemed to make the officers more agitated. David hoped someone was getting this on video, but he also worried it might escalate the situation. "Turn around," Thompson ordered. As David turned to face the officers, he could see the suspicion and hostility in their eyes. They had already decided he was guilty of something, even if they hadn't figured out what yet. "You're acting nervous," Rivera observed. "Why are you nervous if you haven't done anything wrong?" "I'm not nervous," David replied, though his voice betrayed him slightly. "I'm just confused about why this stop is taking so long for a simple traffic violation." "Simple traffic violation?" Thompson stepped closer. "You ran a stop sign, then you gave us attitude about it. Now you're questioning our procedures. That sounds like disorderly conduct to me." David felt the situation spiraling out of control. He had done nothing wrong except drive through a neighborhood while black, but he knew that trying to argue would only make things worse. "I apologize if I seemed disrespectful," he said carefully. "That wasn't my intention. I'm just trying to understand what's happening." "What's happening," Thompson said, pulling out his handcuffs, "is that you're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest." "Resisting arrest?" David couldn't hide his shock. "I've been completely cooperative. I haven't resisted anything." "You questioned our authority and failed to comply with lawful orders," Rivera added. "That's resisting in our book." The handcuffs clicked around David's wrists, cold and tight. He looked around at the gathering crowd, seeing a mix of concern and fear on their faces. Some were still recording, and he hoped that would matter later. As they led him to the patrol car, David tried to process what was happening. He was a respected judge, a pillar of the community, a man who had dedicated his life to justice and the law. Yet here he was, being arrested on fabricated charges because two officers couldn't accept that a black man might belong in a nice neighborhood. The back seat of the police car was hard plastic, designed to be hosed down rather than comfortable. Through the window, David could see his own car still parked on the side of the road, hazard lights blinking in the growing darkness. As they drove toward the station, David remained silent. He was already thinking like a judge, documenting every detail of what had happened. The time, the weather, the exact words spoken, the witnesses present. He knew this wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The fluorescent lights in the police station buzzed constantly, casting everything in a harsh white glow. David had been in police stations before, but always as a visitor or in his official capacity. Never like this. The booking process was deliberately humiliating. Officer Thompson seemed to take pleasure in each step, speaking loudly enough for everyone in the area to hear. "Empty your pockets completely. Everything goes in this tray." David placed his wallet, keys, and phone into the plastic container. His wedding ring went in last, the gold band that he had worn for 23 years. Without it, his finger felt naked and strange. "Face forward," the booking officer instructed, positioning David in front of the camera. The flash was bright and sudden. "Now turn to your right. Good. Turn to your left." The mugshot photos would later become evidence, but right now they just felt like another layer of humiliation. David tried to maintain his dignity, keeping his expression neutral even as his world turned upside down. Fingerprinting came next. The ink was thick and black, staining his fingers as each one was pressed onto the card. David thought about all the times he had reviewed similar fingerprint cards as evidence in his courtroom. He never imagined his own prints would be collected this way. "What's your occupation?" the booking officer asked, not looking up from his paperwork. David hesitated for a moment. "I'm a judge." The officer stopped writing and looked up with a smirk. "A judge?" "Right, and I'm the mayor." He wrote something down and continued with his questions. "Address?" David provided his home address in Oakwood Hills, one of the nicer suburbs in the county. The officer raised an eyebrow but didn't comment this time. After booking, they led David to a holding cell. The small room contained a metal bench bolted to the wall and a toilet with no seat. The smell was a mixture of disinfectant and human misery. David sat on the bench and tried to process what was happening to him. Through the bars, he could see the main area of the station. Officers came and went, processing other arrests from the evening. Some laughed and joked with each other, while others filled out paperwork with bored expressions. None of them seemed to think there was anything unusual about arresting a well-dressed man for running a stop sign that he hadn't actually run. Around midnight, they brought in another man. He was young, maybe early 20s, and clearly intoxicated. The officers were rougher with him than they had been with David, shoving him around and speaking to him with obvious contempt. "I want to call my lawyer," the young man slurred. "You'll get your phone call when we say you get your phone call," Rivera responded. "Right now you need to sober up." David watched this interaction carefully. The young man was clearly drunk, but the officers were denying him his basic rights. As a judge, David had seen countless cases where police misconduct started with small violations like this. Hours passed slowly. David asked several times to make his phone call, but was told he would have to wait. When he mentioned again that he was a judge, the desk sergeant just laughed. "Sure, buddy. And I'm the governor. You know how many people try that line? I'm a doctor. I'm a lawyer. I know the mayor. It's always something." By 3 a.m, David was exhausted but couldn't sleep. The bench was too uncomfortable and his mind was racing with everything that had happened. He thought about his daughter, probably back at her apartment by now, maybe wondering why he hadn't called to let her know he got home safely. He thought about his wife, who was visiting her sister in another state, and had no idea what was happening. A new officer came on duty around 4 a.m. This one seemed slightly more professional than the others, though still skeptical when David asked about his phone call. "Look, I understand you think I'm lying about who I am," David said calmly, "but I have the right to make a phone call regardless of my occupation. I've been here for over 6 hours. The officer, whose name tag read Mitchell, looked uncomfortable. "I'll check with the sergeant about getting you that call." David waited another hour before Mitchell returned. "You can make your call now, but keep it short." The phone was mounted on the wall in a small alcove next to the booking area. David's first instinct was to call his wife, but she was 3 states away and there was nothing she could do. Instead, he called his clerk, hoping she might still be awake. Patricia had worked for David for 8 years. She was probably the most organized person he had ever met, and she often worked late preparing for the next day's cases. The phone rang 4 times before she answered. "Hello?" Her voice was cautious, probably wondering who was calling at this hour. "Patricia, it's Judge Harrison. I need your help." "Judge? What's wrong?" "It's 5 a.m. I've been arrested. I'm at the downtown police station. Can you call Attorney General Roberts and let him know what's happened?" There was a long pause. "Arrested? For what?" "It's a long story. They're claiming I ran a stop sign and resisted arrest, neither of which is true. Can you also call my wife and let her know I'm okay?" "Of course, Judge, I'll make those calls right away. Do you need me to come down there?" "Not yet. Let's see what Roberts can do first. And Patricia, document everything. Times, who you talked to, what they said. This isn't going to end here." After hanging up, David felt slightly better. At least now someone knew where he was and what had happened. Patricia would handle things efficiently, just like she always did. Back in the holding cell, David settled in to wait. He closed his eyes and tried to rest, but his mind kept replaying the traffic stop. Every word, every gesture, every expression on the officers' faces. He was already building his case, not just for his own defense, but for the civil rights lawsuit that would inevitably follow. Around 6 a.m., they brought in coffee and a stale donut for breakfast. The coffee was terrible, weak and bitter, but David drank it anyway. He needed the caffeine to stay alert. The desk sergeant from the night shift was replaced by a new one, a woman who seemed more professional. When she looked at David, her expression was curious rather than dismissive. "You've been here all night?" she asked. "Since about 10:30 last night," David confirmed. She frowned and checked the paperwork. "For disorderly conduct and resisting arrest?" "That's what they charged me with. Though I did neither of those things." The sergeant studied the arrest report more carefully. David could see her reading Thompson's account of the incident, and her frown deepened with each line. "It says here you were argumentative and refused to comply with orders. I was polite and cooperative throughout the entire stop. I never refused any order, and I certainly wasn't argumentative. There should be video from their dashboard cameras." The sergeant made a note in the file but didn't say anything else. David suspected she was beginning to have doubts about the arrest, but he also knew that police officers rarely questioned their colleagues' actions, even when they had concerns. More hours passed. David watched the normal rhythm of the police station as the morning shift took over. Different officers, different faces, but the same casual indifference to the people in the holding cells. Around 9 a.m., David heard a commotion in the main area. Voices were getting louder, and he could sense tension in the air. He couldn't see what was happening from his cell, but something had clearly changed. Officer Mitchell appeared at his cell a few minutes later, looking nervous. "Someone's here to see you," he said, unlocking the door. As David walked toward the main area, he could see a small group of people in expensive suits talking intently with the station commander. One of them was Attorney General Roberts, a man David had known for 15 years. Another was the county's head public defender, and the third was someone David recognized as the police department's internal affairs director. When Roberts saw David, his face went pale. Here was a respected judge still wearing his rumpled suit from the night before, being let out of a holding cell like a common criminal. "David," Roberts said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "What the hell happened here?" The station commander, Captain Morrison, looked like he wanted to disappear. He had just realized that his officers had arrested one of the county's most respected judges on what appeared to be completely fabricated charges. David looked around the room at all the faces staring at him. Some showed shock, others embarrassment, and a few showed fear. The two officers who had arrested him were nowhere to be seen. "That," David said calmly, adjusting his tie, "is exactly what we're going to find out." The silence in Captain Morrison's office was thick enough to cut with a knife. Attorney General Roberts sat across from the captain's desk, his jaw clenched tight. David stood by the window, still wearing his wrinkled suit from the graduation ceremony that felt like a lifetime ago. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Roberts said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Your officers arrested Judge Harrison for running a stop sign that your own traffic cameras show he did not run. Then they charged him with resisting arrest and disorderly conduct despite the fact that he was completely cooperative." Captain Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sir, I'm still gathering all the facts about what happened last night." Officers Thompson and Rivera filed their report according to standard procedure. "Standard procedure?" David finally spoke, turning from the window. "Captain, I was handcuffed and thrown in a cell for 12 hours because your officers decided I didn't belong in my own neighborhood. Is that really standard procedure?" The captain avoided David's eyes. "Judge Harrison, I want to assure you that this department does not tolerate any form of misconduct. If there were errors made last night, we will investigate them thoroughly." Roberts leaned forward. "Errors, Captain? This isn't about errors. This is about two of your officers violating a citizen's civil rights based on racial profiling. The fact that the citizen happens to be a judge makes it even more serious." Patricia, David's clerk, knocked on the door and entered with a thick folder. "Excuse me, Judge Harrison, but I have those documents you requested." David took the folder and opened it. Inside were printouts of the traffic camera footage from the intersection, where he had allegedly run the stop sign. The timestamp clearly showed David's car coming to a complete stop, waiting for the required time, and then proceeding legally through the intersection. "Captain Morrison," David said, handing him the photos. "These images were taken by your own traffic enforcement cameras. As you can see, I stopped completely at the intersection. The stop sign violation that your officers used to justify pulling me over never happened." Morrison studied the photos, and David could see his face growing pale. Without the traffic violation, there was no legal justification for the stop at all. Everything that followed was fruit of the poisonous tree. "There must be some mistake," Morrison said weakly. "Oh, there was definitely a mistake," Roberts replied. "The mistake was your officers assuming they could arrest anyone they wanted without consequences." The Internal Affairs Director, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, had been quietly taking notes throughout the meeting. Now she spoke up. "Captain, I'm going to need to interview Officers Thompson and Rivera immediately. This incident needs to be thoroughly investigated." "Of course," Morrison agreed quickly. "They're both on duty today. I can have them here within the hour." David shook his head. "I don't think so, Captain. Given the circumstances, I believe both officers should be suspended pending the investigation. They clearly demonstrated poor judgment and possible misconduct. Judge Harrison, I understand you're upset, but suspension is a serious step. Perhaps we could handle this with additional training or counseling." Robert stood up abruptly. "Captain, let me explain something to you. Judge Harrison spent 12 hours in your jail on completely fabricated charges. If this had happened to any other citizen, it would be a serious civil rights violation. The fact that it happened to a sitting judge makes it a potential federal crime. So no, additional training is not going to cut it." The room fell silent again. Everyone understood the implications of what Roberts had just said. This wasn't just a local police matter anymore. Federal agencies would likely become involved, and the entire department would be under scrutiny. Patricia spoke up again. "Judge Harrison, I have Chief Deputy Williams on the phone. He says it's urgent." David took the call at Morrison's desk. Chief Deputy Williams was responsible for court security and had worked closely with David for years. "Judge, I just heard what happened. The entire courthouse is talking about it. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Williams. Frustrated and tired, but fine. Sir, there's something else you need to know. The media has gotten wind of this. Channel 7 News is asking for a statement and the newspaper is sending a reporter down to the station." David closed his eyes. He had hoped to handle this quietly through official channels, but that was no longer possible. Once the media got involved, everything would become public. "Thank you for the heads up, Williams. I'll deal with the media when I'm ready." After hanging up, David turned back to the group in the office. "Gentlemen, it appears this story is about to become very public. I suggest we all think carefully about how we want to handle the next few hours." Morrison looked like he was going to be sick. "Judge Harrison, perhaps we could work something out. Some kind of settlement or agreement that would keep this matter private." Roberts laughed bitterly. "Captain, you just suggested covering up a civil rights violation to a sitting judge. I'm beginning to think your entire department needs to be investigated." David held up his hand. "Captain Morrison, I appreciate that you're in a difficult position, but I want to be very clear about something. I did not become a judge to make deals with people who violate the law. I became a judge to ensure that justice is served fairly and equally for everyone." Lieutenant Chen looked up from her notes. "Judge Harrison, would you be willing to provide a formal statement about what happened last night? For the investigation?" "Absolutely. And I want it on record that I will be filing a formal complaint with the state police, the FBI Civil Rights Division, and the Justice Department. This kind of behavior cannot be tolerated from law enforcement officers." Morrison tried one more time. "Judge, surely we can handle this internally. There's no need to involve outside agencies." David stared at the captain for a long moment. "Captain, last night your officers arrested me because they couldn't believe that a black man could live in an expensive neighborhood. They ignored my identification, dismissed my explanations, and fabricated charges against me. Do you really think I should trust your department to investigate itself?" The truth of David's words hung in the air. Everyone in the room knew that if this had happened to anyone else, it would have been swept under the rug. A complaint would have been filed and quietly dismissed. The officers would have received a brief lecture and gone back to work. But it hadn't happened to just anyone. It had happened to Judge David Harrison, a man with the knowledge, resources, and authority to fight back. Roberts gathered his papers. "Captain Morrison, Judge Harrison will be filing formal charges against Officers Thompson and Rivera. I strongly suggest you begin preparing for a very thorough investigation of your department's practices." As they prepared to leave, Morrison made one final attempt. "Judge Harrison, I hope you'll consider that Thompson and Rivera are good officers who may have just made a mistake." David paused at the door. "Captain, good officers don't arrest people for the color of their skin. Good officers don't fabricate charges. And good officers don't ignore constitutional rights. If Thompson and Rivera did those things, then they are not good officers." Outside the police station, a small crowd of reporters and cameras had gathered. David took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and prepared to face them. He knew that what he said in the next few minutes would determine how this story was told. "Judge Harrison," a reporter called out. "Can you tell us what happened last night?" David looked directly into the cameras. "Last night I was arrested by officers who had no legal justification for stopping me, no evidence of any wrongdoing, and no basis for the charges they filed. I was treated like a criminal because 2 police officers made assumptions about me based on my race." "What do you plan to do about it?" another reporter asked. "I plan to ensure that justice is served," David replied. "Not just for me, but for every citizen who has been treated unfairly by those sworn to protect and serve." As he walked to his car, David could see Officers Thompson and Rivera watching from a window inside the station. Both men looked pale and worried, probably just beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had done. David got into his car and started the engine. He had been a judge for 15 years, and he had always believed in the system. He had always trusted that justice would prevail in the end. Now he was about to test that belief like never before. 2 months had passed since that night at the police station. The story had made national news, and the county was still dealing with the fallout. Federal investigators had descended on the police department, and several other cases involving Officers Thompson and Rivera were being reviewed. Judge David Harrison sat in his chambers reviewing the morning's docket. It was going to be an interesting day. 2 cases involving police misconduct were scheduled, and both officers involved were familiar names. At 9 a.m. sharp, David entered his courtroom. The gallery was packed with reporters, civil rights activists, and curious citizens. Word had spread that Thompson and Rivera would be appearing before the judge they had arrested. The first case was called The State versus Anthony Mitchell, with Officer Blake Thompson as the primary witness. Anthony Mitchell was a 19-year-old college student who had been arrested 6 weeks ago for allegedly assaulting a police officer. According to the police report, Mitchell had become violent during a routine traffic stop and had tried to grab Thompson's weapon. But as David reviewed the case file, several things didn't add up. The alleged assault had happened in broad daylight on a busy street, yet there were no civilian witnesses who supported Thompson's version of events. In fact, 3 bystanders had come forward to say they saw no assault at all. Thompson walked to the witness stand, his confidence from that night 2 months ago completely gone. He looked nervous, almost sick. When he saw David in his judge's robes, Thompson's hands began to shake slightly. David maintained perfect judicial composure, but inside he was watching every detail of Thompson's behavior. This was the same man who had handcuffed him and thrown him in jail on fabricated charges. The prosecutor began his questioning. "Officer Thompson, please tell the court what happened on the afternoon of March 15th. Thompson cleared his throat. "I pulled over the defendant for speeding. When I approached his vehicle, he became agitated and confrontational. What happened next? He exited the vehicle without being asked and began advancing toward me in a threatening manner. When I ordered him to step back, he lunged for my weapon." David listened carefully, noting the similarities between Thompson's account of this incident and the report he had filed about David's arrest. The same phrases appeared: agitated and confrontational, threatening manner, failed to comply with orders. The defense attorney, a sharp young woman named Jessica Walsh, stood for cross-examination. "Officer Thompson, you've been a police officer for how long?" 8 years. "In those 8 years, how many times have suspects allegedly tried to grab your weapon?" Thompson hesitated. "I'm not sure of the exact number. Would you say it happens frequently?" "Objection," the prosecutor interrupted. "Relevance?" David sustained the objection, but he could see where the defense was heading. Walsh continued. "Officer Thompson, are you aware that this court recently received video evidence from a nearby security camera?" Thompson's face went pale. "No, I wasn't aware of that." Walsh approached the bench. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter this security footage as evidence." David reviewed the video on his monitor before allowing it to be shown to the jury. The footage clearly showed the traffic stop from beginning to end. Anthony Mitchell never left his vehicle. He never advanced toward Thompson. He never reached for any weapon. In fact, the video showed Thompson pulling Mitchell from the car and throwing him to the ground while the young man's hands were clearly visible and empty. "Officer Thompson," Walsh said after the video finished playing, "can you explain why your testimony doesn't match what we just saw on this video?" Thompson stared at the screen, apparently speechless. Sweat was beading on his forehead. "Officer Thompson," David prompted, The video doesn't show everything. The angle is misleading." "The angle is misleading?" Walsh repeated. "Officer Thompson, are you saying this video, which clearly shows the entire incident, is somehow deceptive?" "Objection," the prosecutor called out, but he sounded desperate. David overruled the objection. The damage was done. Thompson's credibility was completely destroyed, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. During the lunch recess, David returned to his chambers to prepare for the afternoon case. This one involved Officer Rivera and allegations of excessive force during an arrest. Patricia knocked on his door. "Judge Harrison, there's a call for you." "It's Captain Morrison." David took the call reluctantly. "What can I do for you, Captain?" "Judge Harrison, I know this is highly irregular, but I was wondering if you might consider recusing yourself from this afternoon's case. Given the history between you and Officer Rivera..." David cut him off. "Captain Morrison, are you suggesting that I cannot be impartial in my judicial duties?" "No, sir, of course not. I just thought, given the circumstances..." "The circumstances are that Officer Rivera will receive the same fair trial that every defendant receives in my courtroom. If you have concerns about that, you're welcome to file a formal motion." Morrison quickly backed down. No motion will be necessary. I apologize for calling. The afternoon session began with the case of Rivera versus Jennifer Santos. Santos was a nurse who had been arrested for allegedly interfering with police business during a domestic violence call. According to Rivera's report, Santos had inserted herself into the situation and physically prevented him from making an arrest. But Santos claimed she had simply been trying to provide medical assistance to the injured woman and had never interfered with police work. Rivera took the stand with even less confidence than Thompson had shown. He kept glancing at David, as if he couldn't quite believe he was testifying before the judge he had helped arrest. The prosecutor asked Rivera to describe the incident. His account was detailed and specific, painting Santos as an aggressive woman who had no business being at the scene. But when the defense attorney began cross-examination, Rivera's story started to fall apart. "Officer Rivera, you stated that Ms. Santos physically prevented you from making an arrest. Can you be more specific about what she did?" "She stood between me and the suspect," Rivera answered. "How long did she stand there?" Several minutes. "And during this time, what were you doing?" Rivera looked confused. "I was ordering her to move." "For several minutes you were unable to get around one woman who weighs maybe 120 pounds. She was being deliberately obstructive." The defense attorney produced medical records showing that the domestic violence victim had suffered a concussion and possible internal bleeding. Santos had been trying to assess her injuries and provide first aid. "Officer Rivera, isn't it true that Ms. Santos is a trained emergency room nurse with 15 years of experience?" "I don't know about her background." "Isn't it true that she was trying to provide medical care to a seriously injured woman?" "That's not what I observed." But as the defense presented evidence, including testimony from paramedics who arrived later, it became clear that Santos had likely saved the woman's life by providing immediate medical attention. Rivera's credibility, like Thompson's, was in shambles. During closing arguments, both defense attorneys made pointed references to the pattern of misconduct and false reporting that seemed to characterize both officers' work. David listened to everything carefully, maintaining judicial neutrality even as he watched the two men who had arrested him being exposed as dishonest and incompetent. When it came time for verdicts, David dismissed all charges in both cases. The evidence clearly showed that Thompson and Rivera had filed false reports and violated the civil rights of both defendants. The court finds that the testimony of the arresting officers in both cases lacks credibility and is contradicted by physical evidence, David announced. "False police reports and fabricated charges have no place in our justice system." As the courtroom emptied, Thompson and Rivera sat in stunned silence. They had just been publicly humiliated in front of their colleagues, their superiors, and the media. David gathered his papers and prepared to leave. As he passed the two officers, Rivera looked up at him. "Judge Harrison," Rivera said quietly, "I want you to know that what happened that night, we didn't know who you were." David stopped and looked down at both men. "Officer Rivera, that's exactly the problem. It shouldn't matter who I was. You treated me badly because you thought you could get away with it. Every citizen deserves the same respect and protection under the law, regardless of their position or background." Thompson finally spoke up. "We made mistakes, Judge. We know that now." "You didn't make mistakes," David replied firmly. "You made choices. You chose to profile me based on my race. You chose to fabricate charges. You chose to violate my civil rights. Those weren't mistakes. They were deliberate actions." Both officers looked down at their hands, unable to meet David's eyes. David continued toward the door, then paused. "Gentlemen, I hope you learned something from this experience. The badge gives you authority, but it doesn't give you the right to treat people as less than human. Justice works both ways." As David left the courtroom, he could hear the buzz of conversation from reporters and spectators. The story would be front-page news again tomorrow. But for David, this wasn't about revenge or publicity. It was about something much more important, proving that the system could work when people had the courage to stand up for what was right. 6 months later, Judge David Harrison stood before a packed auditorium at the state capitol. He had been invited to speak at a conference on police reform, but this wasn't just another speaking engagement. The events of that night had changed everything, not just for David, but for the entire region. The federal investigation that followed David's arrest had uncovered a pattern of misconduct that ran deep through the police department. 17 other cases involving Thompson and Rivera were reopened. 12 of those resulted in overturned convictions and substantial settlements for wrongfully arrested citizens. Thompson had been fired and faced federal civil rights charges. Rivera had been demoted and was required to complete extensive retraining, though many questioned whether he should have been allowed to keep his job at all. But the real change went far beyond those two officers. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, "6 months ago I thought I understood the justice system completely. I had been a judge for 15 years. I had presided over thousands of cases. I believed that the system worked fairly for everyone." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. "Then I became a defendant myself. And I learned that understanding the system from behind the bench is very different from experiencing it as a black man in handcuffs." David had decided to use his experience as a catalyst for change. Within weeks of his arrest, he had partnered with the NAACP, the American Civil Liberties Union, and several local community groups to push for comprehensive police reform. The first victory had come quickly. The city council, embarrassed by the national attention and facing potential federal oversight, agreed to mandatory body cameras for all patrol officers. The cameras would record all interactions with citizens, and the footage would be automatically uploaded to a secure server that police departments couldn't access or delete. "The body camera program has already made a difference," David continued. "In the first 3 months since implementation, use of force incidents dropped by 40%. Citizen complaints fell by 60%. When officers know they're being recorded, their behavior changes." The second reform was more controversial. David had pushed for the creation of an independent civilian review board with the power to investigate police misconduct and recommend disciplinary action. The police union had fought the proposal hard, but public pressure eventually forced them to accept it. The review board was made up of community members, retired judges, and civil rights attorneys. Most importantly, it had real power. Police departments could no longer investigate themselves when accusations of misconduct arose. David's civil rights lawsuit against the city had been settled for $2.3 million. He had donated every penny to organizations working on criminal justice reform and legal aid for low-income defendants. "Money can't undo what happened," David explained to the audience, "but it can help prevent it from happening to others. We've used the settlement funds to provide legal representation for people who can't afford attorneys, and to train police officers in constitutional law and de-escalation techniques." The training program had been David's idea. Too many officers seemed to have forgotten that their job was to protect and serve, not to intimidate and control. The new training emphasized communication, respect for civil rights, and understanding of implicit bias. "We can't change hearts overnight," David said, "but we can change behavior through proper training and accountability." The most ambitious reform was still in progress. David was working with state legislators to pass a comprehensive police accountability bill. The legislation would require psychological evaluations for all officers, mandate reporting of misconduct by fellow officers, and create a statewide database of police disciplinary records. No longer will bad officers be able to simply move from one department to another when they get in trouble, David explained. If an officer has a pattern of misconduct, every police chief in the state will know about it. After his speech, David took questions from the audience. Many were from police officers themselves, some supportive and others clearly hostile. "Judge Harrison," one officer said, "don't you think these reforms go too far? Police work is dangerous, and officers need to be able to make split-second decisions without worrying about Monday morning quarterbacking." David had heard this argument many times. "Officer, I absolutely understand that police work is difficult and dangerous, but nothing in these reforms prevents officers from protecting themselves or doing their jobs effectively. What these reforms prevent is officers like Thompson and Rivera from abusing their authority and violating citizens' rights." Another question came from a young black law student. "Judge Harrison, how do we make sure these changes are permanent? What happens when the spotlight moves on to other issues?" It was a question that kept David awake at night. That's why community involvement is so crucial. These reforms only work if citizens stay engaged and hold their elected officials accountable. The moment we stop paying attention is the moment things start sliding backward. After the conference, David drove back to his courthouse. It was late evening and the building was mostly empty. He sat in his chambers looking out at the city lights, thinking about how much had changed since that night 6 months ago. His phone rang. It was Patricia calling from home. "Judge, I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I just got a call from the mayor's office. They want to schedule a meeting with you about the police academy curriculum. The new recruits are going to receive training on constitutional law and civil rights as part of their basic instruction." David smiled. It was a small victory, but an important one. "Schedule it for next week, Patricia. And thank you for everything you've done. I couldn't have gotten through this without your help. Judge Harrison, if I may say so, I think what you've done has made a real difference, not just for you, but for everyone in this community." After hanging up, David reflected on Patricia's words. The truth was, he hadn't set out to become a civil rights crusader. He had just been a man driving home from his daughter's graduation, who got pulled over by the wrong officers on the wrong night. But sometimes that's how change happens. Sometimes it takes one person refusing to accept injustice, one person willing to fight back, one person determined to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. David thought about all the people who had been arrested by Thompson and Rivera over the years. People who didn't have his education, his resources, his platform. People who had been processed through the system and forgotten, their civil rights violated without consequence. His arrest had been humiliating and traumatic, but it had also been an opportunity. An opportunity to expose the problems in the system and work to fix them. The reforms they had implemented weren't perfect. There was still work to be done, still changes to be made, but progress was happening. One policy at a time, one training session at a time, one conversation at a time. David gathered his papers and prepared to go home. Tomorrow there would be more cases to hear, more decisions to make, more opportunities to ensure that justice was served fairly and equally. As he walked to his car, David passed the same intersection where he had been pulled over 6 months ago. The stop sign was still there, the one he had never actually run. But now there was something else, a police car parked nearby, its officer watching traffic with what appeared to be professional attention rather than predatory suspicion. David got in his car and headed home, past the houses in his neighborhood where he now belonged without question. The long road to justice was still being traveled, but at least now there were signs pointing in the right direction. Change was possible. Justice was achievable. And sometimes even the worst experiences could become the foundation for something better. The system wasn't perfect, but it could be improved. And David Harrison, the judge who had become a defendant and then a reformer, would continue working to make sure it was.